Thank you so much for joining us today, Eric. Your song cycle, Some Favored Nook for soprano, baritone, and piano, will have its Boston premiere at the next Collage New Music concert. It's wonderful to have you here to speak with us about this work.
Thank you so much, Jingmian.
So, what inspired you to write this large song cycle consisting of 15 songs about Emily Dickinson and Thomas Wentworth Higginson?
Yes, yeah, I was reading a book by the author Brenda Wineapple, which is called White Heat, and it's about the relationship between Emily Dickinson and Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And I found it so interesting. We all know Emily Dickinson as one of the most celebrated American poets. In her day, though, she was completely unknown. And Thomas Wentworth Higginson, on the other hand, many of us may not know of his name, but in his day, he was tremendously well known. He was a noted essayist. He was also an abolitionist and was the commanding officer of the first Black regiment in the Civil War. So he worked to fight to end slavery in the US, but also worked to help support female writers. And Emily Dickinson reached out to him initially to ask for advice on her poetry and getting it published. And so this long 24-year correspondence ensued, and I thought such an interesting story. I wanted to set it to music.
When we look at the text for the music, it seems to come from fragments of different sources like poems, letters, and they have been reconstructed into a complete narrative. So, how did this process come about?
Yes, so I started reading lots of Dickinson's poetry, and I read diary entries that Higginson wrote in his book titled Army Life in the Black Regiment, where he wrote diaries serving on the front in the Civil War with the 1st South Carolina Volunteers Regiment. And so I was reading through and essays he wrote on women writers and the struggles they had to get published in that time period. So I then assembled this whole stream of text that created a kind of narrative, but it was quite unwieldy. And I did this 10 years ago. And, I was at the American Academy in Rome on the Rome Prize Fellowship, and I could not figure out how to move forward. So it was great fortune that I bumped into the librettist Mark Campbell, and I shared with him this libretto, and within a day, he had cut about half of it and gave me back the text that we now have, which has such a great dramatic arc. And the instant I got this new libretto back from him, the streamlined texts, I could instantly start hearing music in my mind. So it's really very much thanks to Mark that this piece has had a life.
The next question I have is about the title, Some Favored Nook. So the title appears not at the beginning, but later in the fourth song. What's the significance of this phrase as the title of the entire song cycle?
So this quote, Some Favored Nook, comes from an essay that Thomas Wentworth Higginson wrote called Repression at Long Range, and speaking about female writers and how he said you might think of a female writer at this time as being a plant that doesn't have soil that's yet fitted for its reception, and it's only in some favored nook that it manages to survive at all. And so this is kind of the crux of that first act of the piece. And Mark Campbell, when he finished the libretto, he pulled that line out and said, I think this should be the title of the piece. And I think it works so beautifully because if you've thought of Emily Dickinson, she's had this aura of being a kind of reclusive poet. I visited her house in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she has her bedroom where she did a lot of writing, and her writing desk is right there. And you might think of it as some favored nook, corner, a little small area, intimate space that she kind of imagined the whole world, and has now touched so many hearts. But at that time, it was really her work was confined to that room. We didn't, it was only 10 works of her poems were published in her lifetime. And I think that's what he was also saying. But now she is world famous. And so it's gone beyond that. And so I think that it's felt like a very beautiful lens for the piece, and also helped me think about the very intimate, delicate piano writing that happens throughout, that it's thinking of music, chamber music of the home, that's very intimate. but has a deep core that's wanting to break beyond that in a more
Mhm.
public way.
So the last question I have is about your music more generally, or at least about your recent pieces. So in your short stories performed by Collage just earlier this month, and your recent double concerto for two violas, and the song cycle Some Favored Nook, we often hear musical conversations and intimate connections, whether between people and characters who might be physically far apart, or as in short stories, between seemingly unrelated sonic events. So it feels like your music is often inspired by these relationships you've observed. How do you find music within them?
Such a great question, such an insightful observation about my music, and I think it's completely true that in almost every piece I've written recently, there are these juxtapositions of intense contrast, and whether it's actual physical distance, where I have a piece I'm conducting this weekend at Brown, where I actually physically place players all around at all the different corners of the hall around the audience. So you're actually having these sounds that are from a very far distance. But even just thinking about something that's um, musically very different from one another, I feel that there's two answers to the question. One is that I find that drama comes from this element of contrast. I also feel like it reflects some question about everyday life where there's so many things that happen, how we might construct a day in a logical form. There are things like I'm walking down the street, there might be a leaf blower going, or I get an email I was not expecting, or you go online and you see some tragedy in the news, but then you turn on the TV and you're laughing to a comedy, a sitcom that you might watch at night. And so there's so many different ways that you're being pulled in different directions, but you find a life and meaning in life amidst it all. And so that's kind of my way of it's actually what makes me excited to compose is to take something that maybe doesn't fit with something else and then try to understand how it could be meaningful to connect with it some way.
Thank you for sharing these wonderful insights about your music today. And we look forward to hearing your song cycle, Some Favorite Nook, at our next Collage New Music concert on the afternoon of November 3rd at Longy School of Music.
Thank you so much, Jingmian, and hope to see everyone there.